Hi there! Since you've clicked on this video, you've probably heard the term VTuber before, but what exactly is a VTuber? A VTuber is a digital puppet controlled by face and motion tracking software, allowing content creators, particularly live streamers, to act as the character in real time. They're a great alternative to facecam when streaming, whether you want to portray a different personality or represent yourself in a unique way. However, aspiring VTubers have a big problem. These digital puppets, or VTuber models, are not cheap. They can cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. So are VTuber models worth the price, or are artists ripping off aspiring streamers? How difficult is it to make your own? Sure, you may not have professional illustration skills or even know how to use the VTuber software, but assuming you can cobble together some digital art, it might just be possible to bring it to life, and that's exactly what I set out to do. You'll need 3 pieces of software to make a VTuber. Some type of art software to draw the VTuber, an animation and rigging software to define how the character moves, and finally, a face tracking software to translate your movement to the model's movement. Now, we're going the 2D route with this. Even though using a pre-made 3D model can be easier than making a new 2D model, 3D can be tough starting from scratch. You can pick any program you want to draw your VTuber in. However, you need to export a Photoshop file with layers and transparency. Sorry, Microsoft Paint. Krita and GIMP are good free options, while Clip Studio Paint, Procreate, and of course Photoshop are solid paid choices. Just use whatever program you feel most comfortable drawing in. Next, you'll need to pick an animation software that's capable of rigging a 2D model for live tracking and character animation. I'll explain what the process of rigging your model means later in the video, but just for now, know that it sets up your 2D model for animation. Live 2D is the most dominant program when it comes to VTubers. Pretty much any anime girl that looks like this is probably using Live 2D. The software is designed to animate your 2D image in layers to create a 3D effect. You can then export your model to a face tracking program in order to animate it in real time. Live 2D is a popular choice with a big community and lots of tutorials online. However, the free version is a bit limiting in terms of how high resolution and complex your model can be. You can still get a free trial of the full version for 42 days, but eventually it requires a paid subscription of about $16 per month. But what if you have no money? Enochi2D is an open source program being developed as an alternative to Live 2D. The good news is that it's free, and some people have managed to get decent results from the program. However, I can't really recommend it for beginners. I might still give it a shot after learning Live 2D. Lastly, there is Adobe Character Animator. A lot of what I've seen from this program attempts to mimic Flash-style animation with real-time motion capture. While a less popular choice, I think it works for certain character designs. If you already have an Adobe subscription, I would recommend considering whether or not the features work for you. As for me, I have no Adobe subscription and wanted the strong community support, so I opted for Live 2D. With that settled, we can move on to picking out face tracking software. Adobe Character Animator and Enochi have their own features for viewing your model, but if you make your model in Live 2D, you'll have more options, such as VTube Studio and PRPR Live. There are technical differences in how each of these work, but they share the same goal: to track your face and animate your Live 2D model accordingly. Both of these programs should work decently if you're using a webcam to track your face. PRPR Live has basic face tracking for free with a $10 upgrade for a supposedly more accurate look. Meanwhile, VTube Studio puts a watermark for face tracking until you pay them money, but it also has a slick iPhone app that works really well with the PC version. I went with VTube Studio because I wanted to use my iPhone, and I didn't mind the one-time fee. With our software finally in order, let's switch to your Artist tab, because it's time to illustrate our character. Character design and illustration are entire disciplines that are out of scope of this video. Everyone watching this is at different skill levels, but that's okay. As long as you can draw some sort of character, with a little bit of tweaking, you can turn it into a VTuber. So let's focus on some things I learned that apply specifically to illustrating a VTuber model. You might worry that your art style doesn't fit well with other VTubers you see. This is a valid concern because your style will reflect how you animate your character. However, uniqueness isn't the root of the problem. You need to have some idea of how your character is going to be separated in parts to move with your face. Consider the following requirements in your design. Every part of your model that is going to move needs to be drawn on a separate layer. These parts will then shift and warp in order to create the illusion of animation. You can swap out parts midway, but you won't be able to draw every possible frame. I realize this is a lot to consider from the very start. One of the hard things about making a VTuber is that you're expected to foreshadow and draw things a certain way when you already don't know what you're doing. One of the best things you can do is find models similar to what you want to do. This will be easy if you're an anime girl, but there are a lot of other creative avatars out there to take inspiration from. Look at what parts they move, how far they move, and how they move together. Just keep in mind that every part should be fully drawn on its own layer. So if your face is usually covered by hair, but you still want it to move, you need to draw the entire face underneath. One mistake I made was not giving myself as much wiggle room as I could have when it came to overdrawing parts. If you don't overdraw as much as possible, it's going to limit the movement in your final model as you try to stop it from breaking. You might notice that I drew my character as a half-body image, while many VTubers are full-body. I personally plan on only using face tracking and wanted to keep things simple. You're welcome to draw out the rest of the body though, if desired. It is possible to use the upper body movements or other tricks to move the lower half. Once your art is drawn and broken up into dozens of little pieces, all fully realized, and you formulated at least a vague idea of how you want it to move and follow your face, you should be good to move on to the next step. Congratulations on finishing your artwork. Now we have to import that static image into Live 2D in order to bring it to life. But don't get too excited. There's some work you have to do before you can actually start animating. If you've heard the term rigging before, you might think of rigging a 3D model for skeletal animation. This basically means putting a bunch of digital bones inside a model, which defines how a character moves. Programs like Adobe Character Animator can do this for 2D images, but Live 2D works a little differently. When people talk about rigging a Live 2D model, it involves setting up parts of the model with meshes and deformers, then moving them into different poses in order to create the animation. In order to set up your VTuber, you need to create parts for every imported layer of your model. Then, assign these parts a draw order, so you know which parts should be drawn on top of the other. In order to deform these parts, you must create a mesh for each one. A mesh is just a set of interconnected points on top of your artwork. These meshes can be hand-drawn for fine control or automatically generated. Arrange all those parts into something called a texture atlas, and you have a big file of everything you use to create your model. So while you can move points on your meshes individually, it is generally tedious and I wouldn't recommend it. Live 2D gives you several tools in order to help make this animation process a bit easier. The simplest tool is called a warp deformer, which should cover your mesh and can be pulled to deform your art shape. I recommend you put this on every part of your model. If you want parts to rotate or bend instead of just warping around, use rotators in order to have that rotational motion, such as shoulders or tilting your character's neck. Finally, path deformers allow you to draw a path along the mesh of your part so that it can bend easily. This is really useful for things like hair. And if you want two meshes to be stuck together even when moving, you can use a tool called glue in order to piece them together. You can even move multiple parts at the same time by making one deformer a parent of the other, so that the movement of the parent part affects the movement of a child part. These child deformers will then be affected by the parent's movement, but not the other way around. That's pretty much all the basic tools you'll need to set up your model for Live 2D. I strongly recommend you take a look at examples and other tutorials out there for more details as you actually work through it. I found myself a bit discouraged by the lengthy setup process and how much you had to learn up front, but thankfully taking your time during this segment makes animation a lot easier. Once the setup is complete, we can finally get to the fun part, animating your model. Live 2D models move based on their keyforms, which mark the start and end positions for moving parts in your model. Suppose you want to make an animation of your model turning its head left and right. In that case, you would create keyforms for all parts on your head looking forward, left, and right. You'll need at least one start and end keyform for movement, but as in the face example, you can put keyforms in between other keyforms. Live 2D will fill in all the motion in between. Remember that a moving parent object will move all of its child objects as well. You can even put additional motion on the child object, and both the parent and the child's movement will be applied. For example, you can create animations of the eyeball looking around, but it will follow the eye as it moves with your face, as long as the eyeball is child of your main eye. This is one of those things I suggest you play around with, as it's more intuitive than it sounds on paper. But what determines what stage of this animation your model is currently in between keyforms? In normal animation, this would be a timeline, but here, time is replaced with values called parameters. These are numbers that control the keyforms of your model. They're just values that can change within a certain range. As these values change, your model will shift and warp to different keyforms. You could theoretically have any data change these parameters and move your model, so long as the software supports it. But the real magic happens is when you take input from a face tracking software and alter the value of the parameters to animate the model in real time. This is the final magic of the VTuber. Facial data translated into numbers, controlling parameters, controlling the animation on screen, and thus creating the illusion of life. Take a look at the inputs of your facial tracking software and try to take advantage of those first. Make parameters for the inputs you want to use. Many can be considered essential, but not all. For example, you aren't required to have a cheek puff effect, even though your software tracks it, but your model won't respond to any inputs you choose to ignore. so it's best to rig as much movement as you can, assuming it's within scope of your project, of course. Once again, dissecting example models really helps here. Go ahead and look at what parameters they have and how those parameters control their individual keyforms. You can even link similar parameters together in order to interpolate motion between them. For example, you can link the X and Y movement of your eyeball and auto-generate the diagonal values. You still have a lot of animation to do though. It takes some time to deform every part of your model for convincing movement, compounded by the number of parameters you want to take advantage of. Check your work incrementally to ensure that all your smaller animations are blending together nicely. Theory is nice, but execution tends to be difficult. Let's talk about some areas where I struggled. Firstly, the mouth movement. Some animation software like Adobe Character Animator use visemes, or sets of mouth shapes for lip syncing animation. In Live 2D, you have to deform with just the parameters that your tracking software gives you. Some clever people have mapped these values to larger sets of mouth animations for better lip syncing, but depending on your model's mouth, they may or may not work. The style of your model doesn't always match up to reality. I opted for a simple mouth opening and closing effect, with the smiling value controlling how wide the sides pull up. I'm not entirely happy with this result, but it works for now. Just be aware that more advanced techniques exist if they fit your style. Another thing I recommend being careful of is the eye animations, especially if any of your design is off-center. You want your eyes to move at exactly the same time, otherwise it just looks weird. So make sure they're a similar distance. And if any parts of your model are symmetrical, you can just copy and paste them over from one side to the other to save yourself animation time. So now your model is moving, but something's different. Something's missing from the other models you see. Where's the wobble, the jiggle, for hair physics? The final polish to your model is physics animation, but don't worry, you don't have to do any math here. In Live 2D, physics works with parameter inputs, outputs, and an internal pendulum. Inputs are the base movements that cause a physics movement, like your head moving. This base movement makes an internal pendulum swing. You can then use the motion of that swinging pendulum to drive an output parameter, making part of your model animate. You can even add multiple inputs with different levels of effect. Just make sure that the inputs are not set to 0 or else nothing will animate properly. I also personally didn't find the templates Live 2D comes with very helpful as I have a non-traditional model, but feel free to experiment with those if you feel they'll work for you. I would highly suggest watching a more detailed video if you want the theory of how certain parts should use physics motion, like this hair tutorial. Presumably, at this stage, you'll be stuck in a loop of tweaking your animations, physics, and fine-tuning your facial tracking parameters. And at some point, with weary eyes, you'll gaze upon your final model and say, good enough. So yeah, this is the model I finished with. I'm super happy to see my art animated like this for the first time, and I think I've accomplished my goal. So now you have some idea of the effort it takes to make a VTuber model. I would argue that the price of a VTuber commission reflects the effort put in by artists and riggers. It's a challenging project both technically and artistically, but that's my favorite type of project. So go forth and create your own digital puppets. If any of this was helpful to you, feel free to share your creations on me with Twitter using the hashtag here. Also, if there's any corrections needed for this video or questions, go ahead and leave a comment. I'll try to update the description and respond as needed.